Hello everyone, and thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Profiteers versus the People, the podcast where we myth bust the mega wealthy, call out corporate greed, and try to bring meaningful resources to all of you, our wonderful listeners. My name is Money Mike, and as you may have noticed from the title of this one, Rad Bill unfortunately will be unable to join me this week. And as much as I wanted to make a callback to his handjobs for the homeless joke to explain his whereabouts, the truth is that Rad had an emergency come up that he just needed to handle. If you guys could, keep our dearest Rad in your thoughts during this time, and if you have a few seconds, maybe shoot him a quick email or reach out on Reddit. I know that he'd really appreciate it. I promise that we will convene in the coming weeks to put the finishing touches on our second Mowbray episode, but for now you guys are stuck with me. But anyway, on to our episode. Because Rad won't be able to add his biting wit to the mix of our episode today, I thought that it might make a little more sense to tell you a story about what happens when large corporations are permitted to do as they please. So, to set the stage for the story, we need to go all the way back to 1917, when the Union Carbide Company, the National Carbon Company, the Lind Air Products Company, and the Presto Light Company all merged to form the Union Carbide and Carbon Corporation, also known as UCC. Now, Union Carbide's PR loves to brag that this merger gave birth to the petrochemical industry, which feels a lot like bragging about giving birth to the extended car warranty industry, but UCC's website is still pretty proud of it. But anyway, in the years following, Union Carbide became a corporate Pac-Man, devouring other businesses and rapidly expanding into a wide array of industries at all points in the vertical means of production. The growing demand for industrial gases, ferroalloys, and batteries brought on by the outbreak of World War I served as accelerant that created a corporate explosion that lasted throughout the Great Depression. Now, as the years passed, UCC became an enormous, sprawling corporate monstrosity, with subsidiaries and plants all over the globe. And then, in 1934, as a part of this great expansion, UCC partnered with investors in India, including the Indian government, to form Union Carbide India Limited, also known as UCIL. Now, we need to pause here for a second and talk a little bit about what the relationship looked like between UCC and UCIL, because it will become a point of contention later in our story. So from an ownership standpoint, UCC owned 50.9% of UCIL. And since UCC had formed a habit of pumping out subsidiaries like Elon Musk pumps out right-wing propaganda, they had the whole thing down to a pretty exact science. According to Bhopal, Union Carbide, and the hubris of the capitalist technocracy, which, holy shit, what a fucking name, UCC required all subsidiaries to adopt their corporate policies. And on top of that, all the capital and technology that was deployed in the plants built by UCIL came directly from UCC. So, while they may have been half a world away from their US parent, UCIL was still very much connected and also dependent upon UCC. And all of UCIL's policies came directly from UCC. So anyway, now back to our story. In 1969, UCIL decided to open a pesticide plant in Bhopal, India, to manufacture two particular pesticides that were popular at the time, Sevin and turmeric. And these chemicals made for great insecticide due to the simple fact that they were pretty phenomenal at killing pretty much anything that they came in contact with. And the process to manufacture these chemicals requires a little molecule called methyl isocyanate, which I will be referring to as MIC going forward simply because my mouth only has one correct pronunciation of that word in it. For all of you wonderful listeners that might have been wondering what this mouth do, it's definitely not correctly pronouncing deadly compound names. But anyway, MIC is derived from two other compounds, phosgene, which is a chemical weapon that was used during World War I, and methylamine, which is used to make crystal meth. Now, both phosgene and MIC are extremely toxic gases and can be lethal if even a small amount is inhaled. Now, the question that we need to answer to really get an idea about what UCC wanted out of all this is why? Well, the PR story is that the company wanted to ride the wave of the quote-unquote green revolution that was currently washing over India. Now, contrary to the environmentalist sentiments that the name suggests, the Green Revolution was a farming initiative that aimed to eliminate food insecurity in India through modern farming techniques. Ironically, none of these techniques were remotely environmentally friendly, but they were trying to put food in people's mouths, so I guess I can't fault them there. However, there are a couple important facts that the PR leaves out that we need to keep in mind. First, this plant in Bhopal was not the first of its kind. There were already two identical plants, one in West Virginia, where the MIC had been previously manufactured and stored, and another in France. However, this new plant was slightly different than the others because it lacked a computer system that was designed to automatically stop leaks. Additionally, the Bhopal plant only had 8 shutdown devices when 24 would have been standard procedure for a plant of its size. And the reasoning for this difference was to cut costs. Second important piece of information. The late 60s were a time that workplace protections were starting to gain some steam in the US. And while it wasn't founded yet, OSHA would be founded in 1971. India, on the other hand, did not have the same protections for workers, and being that the Indian government was a part owner of UCIL, it was easy to influence the regulatory environment. Allegedly. There's no direct proof of that. UCIL built this plant in the northern part of Bhopal, which was mostly occupied by extremely impoverished people living in shanty towns. You see, due to the Industrial Revolution that was occurring in India at the time, the city of Bhopal grew from a population of about 100,000 in 1950 to around 1 million in 1984. And with this rapid population growth, wealth inequality was severe. This will come into play later. So they built this plant, and unfortunately, by the mid-1970s, things were not looking so great for UCIL or for India. First, there was a global recession that was impacting everyone, especially producers like UCIL and UCC, but more importantly, there was a famine going on in India which greatly reduced the need for insecticides. However, in the late 1970s, UCIL did something peculiar. They applied for a license with the Indian government to increase the amount of MIC that this plant could hold. Now, their justification was that they were hoping to create a monopoly on the substance, but experts agree that this justification really doesn't play. Why would a company seek approval to hold more of an extremely dangerous substance that they needed even less of than they did previously? And simultaneously, referencing these economic conditions, UCIL began to start cutting costs beyond the shoddy initial construction of the plant. Like any company, they began laying off workers, specifically the quote-unquote skilled workers who had more education and experience because these workers were more expensive to retain. And then they stopped being as quick to replace equipment. And by the early 1980s, the Bhopal plant was being run by a skeleton crew of workers that were constantly performing tasks that they hadn't been properly trained to perform, all for the sake of storing and manufacturing literal chemical weapons. And it was only a matter of time before disaster struck. And then, in 1981, it did. Some phosgene escaped containment and killed one of the plant's workers, sending another to the hospital. And then, just a month later, another phosgene leak occurred, sending another 25 workers to the hospital. Now, at this point, UCIL decided to call mom, and UCC sent an investigative team out to the plant. This team found 61 safety violations. And all the while, workers and journalists in Bhopal were begging UCIL and the Indian government to do something about the state of this plant. One reporter in particular, Raj Kumar Keswani, happened to be a friend of that person who died in 1981, and he wrote scathing articles about UCIL, describing Bhopal as a, quote, city on the edge of a volcano. However, even in the wake of this damning report by UCC, as well as the immense public outcry around the state of the plant, production continued and corners continued to be cut. By 1984, even more fail-safes that had been put in place to prevent disaster were being taken offline. First, they took the scrubber offline. Now, this was a device that would spray any escaped gas with a neutralizing agent in the event of a leak. And then they shut down the refrigeration unit that kept the underground tanks of MIC cold to prevent pressure buildup. And then the flare tower, which uses fire to neutralize any escaped gas, was also taken offline. This last one, they were supposedly upgrading it, but these upgrades never actually happened. And all of this was done in the name of cutting costs. And then, between 8 and 9 p.m. on December 2nd of 1984, workers were ordered to flush a pipe leading to the 3 underground MIC tanks with water. However, when they agreed to perform this task, there were a few things they didn't know. First, each 60-ton tank was only supposed to hold 30 tons of MIC. At the time that they were flushed, each tank was holding over 40 tons of MIC, so they were far more full than they were supposed to be. Second, the safety valve that was supposed to ensure that water did not reach the tanks of MIC from the pipes that they were flushing had been uninstalled. So when the water from the pipes hit the tanks of MIC, it created an exothermic reaction which caused heat and pressure to rapidly rise. By 11:30 p.m., it was obvious that something was terribly wrong. Workers could smell MIC around the tank, which meant that the concentration of the chemical in the air was already 20 times healthy limits. So, the workers responded by spraying some water around these tanks and going on a tea break. And this is a strange detail that I've read in every account of this disaster. Some indicate that the supervisor wasn't worried about the leak and kind of uses this whole tea break thing as evidence that the people in charge didn't think that it was a big deal. But other sources tend to lean more into the idea that they were really just trying to take a step back and figure out what the hell to do. But either way, after the break, the workers in the plant started frantically scrambling to contain this leak. First, they tried to activate the scrubber to neutralize the gas, but as you might remember, it had been previously taken offline, and it fails. Then, they tried to spray water on the gas, but the hose didn't have enough pressure to spray high enough. And then, they tried to activate the refrigeration unit that had been turned off, but it was completely out of Freon. And by 1 a.m., it was evident that things had gone completely pear-shaped. Many workers began fleeing the plant, and the supervisor sounded the alarm. But only for a moment, and this is another strange detail because it's unclear as to why the alarm was turned on and then turned off at this point. But the result was that those who were not awakened by the alarm that were working the night shift were only woken up by the effects that MIC was having on their body. Now, I'm going to put a trigger warning here because I'm going to get a little gory. But I think that it's important to discuss exactly what exposure to MIC does to a person, just to drive home how important it was that they prevented a leak. Skip to 1332. MIC causes severe damage to every component of the respiratory system, as well as the eyes. If it gets inhaled, the lungs essentially fill up with fluid and the throat closes up. And if MIC gets in the eyes, it can cause temporary or permanent blindness. So, in non-medical terms, those who did not wake up in time for that alarm drowned in their own bodily fluids in the dark because they couldn't see. By 1:15 a.m., the police arrived to a scene of absolute pandemonium. Remember, guys, this is literally a chemical weapon that has been unleashed on a city of 1 million people. This is doomsday shit. By 2:30, they finally stopped this leak, but the damage is already done. By the time the army arrives at 3 a.m., they're just carting people to the nearest hospital. By sunrise, 12,000 people had been hospitalized. The following morning, that number became 55,000 and then 170,000. After a short time, a deadly cloud of MIC covered a 20 square kilometer area of Bhopal. Now, the exact death toll of this disaster is uncertain, but some estimates put it as high as 19,000 people. For years after the disaster, birth defects skyrocketed, and those who survived later fell ill with various cancers and respiratory problems. Like, this is Mad Max shit. Bhopal became a wasteland All said and done, it's estimated that this disaster negatively affected 500,000 people. And with numbers like that, it's really easy for them to lose their meaning. And I'm stealing this quote, but they say that one death is a tragedy, but 1,000 is a statistic. And I think that that really rings true. But every single one of these lives were precious and valuable, and each death and lifelong injury caused immeasurable pain and suffering. There's a website that I'll list in the sources. It's called the International Campaign for Justice in Bhopal, where you can read some firsthand accounts of this disaster, and I'll warn you, they are absolutely harrowing. I was going to read a few excerpts, but they're quite long, and frankly, I had to put a trigger warning every 3 seconds, so if that's something that you want to research yourself, that's where to find it. But you might be wondering, how did UCC respond to all this? Well, my sweet, darling listeners, they passed the buck, and at some points, they just relied on some good old-fashioned racism. In response to the disaster, UCC had 5, quote, contentions to limit their responsibility. 1, according to them, they had a great safety record. Their slogan was, quote, production at a cost, safety at any cost, end quote. And this is hilarious to the point of dark comedy. UCC had a horrible safety record. I kept this out of the beginning so I didn't give anything away, but Union Carbide was responsible for the Hawks Nest Tunnel disaster not a couple decades before, which is one of the worst industrial disasters in US history that was entirely caused by corporate greed and cutting corners. Like, it's hilarious to cause yet another disaster and be like, hey man, look at our history. Like, these guys had a higher KD than John Wick. They were murdering people for years. The second contention that UCC had was essentially, it was the Indian state's fault. They let us do this. But like we said, all of the technology that UCIL had came from UCC. And there is evidence that UCC lied to the Indian state about the deadliness of MIC so that the Indian state would allow them to store it there. So that's bullshit. Third contention, UCIL was independent. And we talked about this earlier. No, they weren't. UCIL was a puppet and UCC was the master. And these last 2 contentions is where it gets really fucked. So the fourth contention was, quote, India's cultural backwardness. That's just racism. The last one was there was a natural proclivity towards sabotage, which is not only racist, it's also deliberate misdirection. So in the court cases that followed, UCC kept inserting this sabotage narrative that somebody in the plant not related to UCC did this on purpose for a variety of ends. There was no evidence that was the cause of this disaster at all. And the courts agreed. So in spite of all of their whining, in 1989, so 5 years after the disaster, UCC settled to pay $470 million to be, I'm quoting from an article here, immune from responsibility. Legally, I don't know what that means, but it sounds like it shouldn't be allowed. And the Indian government also paid $3.3 billion. So, where did UCC's money come from? Well, it came from shareholders' dividends. I didn't find anything on this, but I can only wonder what the CEO's bonus was that year. But either way, after all the courtroom bureaucracy, it averaged out to about 80 USD per victim, which is so fucking pathetic that I want to spend the next 5 minutes ranting about it, but I'm going to restrain myself because we're going to get back to meager corporate settlements in a bit, but for now, we need to hone in on why. Why the fuck did something so preventable occur, and what should we learn from it? So, in this next section, I am borrowing heavily from the piece I referenced earlier, Bhopal, Union Carbide, and the Hubris of the Capitalist Technocracy. Which, again, what a fucking title. But how did it come to this? First is export hazard. Do you remember back to when we were raising our eyebrow at why UCC wanted more MIC in India, where the demand for that MIC was precipitously dropping? Well, it was because they knew from a risk standpoint, Indian lives were worth less than American lives. And on top of that, they lied to the Indian government about the dangers of MIC to get it over there. Remember, before this plant, MIC was being stored in West Virginia. Second, remember when workers and journalists were warning everyone about the dangers of the Bhopal plant and no one did shit about it? Well, these are the dangers of a weak labor force. The article describes these workers as, quote, weak and divided. There's a quote from this article that really encapsulates how divided the workforce was. You remember how we made that differentiation between skilled and unskilled workers? Quote, capital has always attempted to buttress its control by strengthening the differences between intellectual and manual labor. These processes are reinforced by the education system, which is, of course, a major means of articulating the relationship between the social and technical division of labor, unquote. This is why unions exist. In Bhopal, the UCIL plant was the largest employer in the middle of an actual shantytown. You can't blame workers there for not risking their only source of sustenance to strike. But we still need to learn from the power dynamics at play here and understand that when corporations hold all the power, people fucking die. Third, remember when people ran to the government and they didn't do anything? This was a direct result of a weak government that may or may not have been in bed with the corporation that was killing its citizens. Union Carbide got exactly what they fucking wanted. They built a shoddy plant without the fail-safes of their Western counterparts and got to dump their toxic material in a developing nation where they thought lives were less meaningful. They built a plant, took away all of the resources to run that plant just so they could save a few pennies. You remember that refrigeration unit that they shut down? That cost $50 a day to run. But finally, and perhaps most importantly, how do we prevent this from happening again? Well, first, and I promised that I would get back to this, we need consequences for leaders. When Warren Anderson, the CEO of UCC, visited Bhopal, he was immediately arrested by the Indian government. Now, of course, he was able to post bail, and all of the other Indian employees who were convicted of criminal negligence served extremely light sentences. But this is something that we hear about all the time. People die, and shareholders pay money while those at the top run away scot-free. Fines need to be substantial and paid by people, not corporations. In February of 2023, OSHA suggested that Amazon pay $46,000 in fines for violations in their warehouses. $46,000 to a company like Amazon is a goddamn rounding error, and it's embarrassing that we would even levy a fine like that. Second, workers need rights, and that starts with the unions. Third, governments can't be so easily captured by profit seekers. Well, gang, that is our episode. Thank you so much for tuning in, and like I said before, please give Rad some love on Reddit or via email. He mostly runs that side of things, so to hear that any of you are thinking about him would absolutely make his day. I love you all, and goodbye.